First, I want to thank the last presentation because I think my presentation will really dovetail nicely on a good, rich description of what was happening and what is happening with immigrants in the U.S. I also want to thank AIR and NCS as well as the OECD. I was able to get specific wage information from the OECD through a Thomas J. Alexander Fellowship. And lastly, I want to apologize. Frank unfortunately couldn't make it here, but he also wants to thank those institutions and was unfortunately not able to make it. Okay. We looked at education and the wage gaps comparatively with the United States and Canada. And a couple of definitional pieces off the top is that we are looking at immigrants in the study defined as first-generation immigrants only. And so we're looking at individuals that were born outside of the U.S. and natives, similar to the last presentation, is defined as those individuals that were born within the U.S. or within Canada. Okay. I have controls. Good. Okay, so the immigrant wage gap. First, there's a lot of research that shows, as expected, and as demonstrated in the last presentation, that immigrants in both the United States and Canada earn less on average than their native peers. But a lot of this past research has been limited, partially due to past research looking at only a single country sample. Also, one of the great benefits of PIAAC, as you've seen throughout the day, is focused on skills. And we're going to focus more on literacy and numeracy skills in this presentation. And then one of the unique contributions to this presentation and this paper, hopefully, is the ability, thanks to the available information through this data set, to actually match first-generation immigrants and native employees by occupational field. Okay. So why are we comparing the United States and Canada? First, this is a great, interesting opportunity, especially at a unique time point in our country's history, to look at a country that has some similarities with us, but a starkly different immigration policy. And so the immigration policy in Canada is primarily a points-based system, while the immigration policy in the U.S. focuses more on family reunification. What that leads to, the different policy then leads to different immigrant populations demographically. And so in Canada, we have about 68% of first-generation immigrants in Canada arriving after the age of 20, where we have over 50% of first-generation immigrants in the U.S. arriving before the age of 20. We also have, past research has found that nearly every immigrant that comes to Canada on a points-based system has the equivalent of a bachelor's degree, which is obviously much higher than the native population in Canada. So we have an older, more educated, more skilled population from a points-based system in Canada, and a younger, less skilled and less educated population from a family reunification system in the U.S. It's also interesting that both of these countries are considered destination countries. So 50% of all OECD immigrants and most immigrants with higher education are coming to Canada or the U.S. And because of the similarities, especially in their education system, this presents an opportunity to have a strategic contrast between these two cases, where because we have similarities in the education system, we're able to look at potential outcomes of that education system and make a better, more clear distinction that it's the outcome of the education system, that it's the policy environment and not differences in the education system, for instance, comparing the U.S. to Germany, where it has much different levels of tracking involved. Okay. The importance of comparison. I don't need to spend much time on this, but obviously immigration is very interesting in the U.S. right now, and there's a lot of talk on the skills and education levels of immigrants in the U.S., and that this provides us an opportunity to look at what might a different policy in the U.S., maybe something similar to Canada, look like. Okay, so based on these different policies, we ended up with 4 hypotheses. So first is that first-generation immigrants in Canada will have relatively more education and higher skills than their peers in the U.S. This is along the lines of past research. Secondly, the more educated and higher skilled immigrant population in Canada will then hold positions in higher wage occupational fields. Third, the immigrant wage gap will be less pronounced in Canada, largely due to that higher education and skill base. And fourthly, that the immigrant wage gap in both the United States and Canada is going to differ depending on the occupational field we look at. Okay, our data and methods We're using mainly public use data files other than the restricted wage data we're able to get through the OECD. The main methodology we're using here is a path analysis. It's an additive model, and then we do it for the whole sample, and then we go also by occupational field for each country, and we do some multinomial logistic regression as well. Okay. This is our model. And so here, it's an additive model, and I'm mainly concerned with path A. Okay, path A is what we consider the immigrant wage gap. So the direct effect of immigrant status on wage defined as monthly wage. Okay. We also know that immigrant status has an impact on educational attainment, and I'm looking for the indirect effect of wage through educational attainment and literacy and numeracy. One important thing to note here is that problem solving is not included in the model. And as was pointed out earlier, there was a large section of the U.S. that did not do problem solving, and out of that, I think 16% that did not do problem solving, it was disproportionately immigrants. And so because it was disproportionately immigrants, they were removed from this sample because it basically removed my sample size to something I couldn't do. Okay, so we have the direct effect on immigrant status to wage, and then indirectly through educational attainment, literacy, and numeracy. We also are controlling for a host of variables, including how long they've been in that position, how many hours they work per week, the area of study, their ICT adeptness. Initially, I wanted to include this in here, but it's a self-reported variable asking, basically, do you have the ICT skills necessary to do your job? And everybody's really confident with that. Over 90% of everybody believes they've got all the skills they need. So there's very little variance in that. And then also controlling for gender and age. All right, so going back to the hypotheses. So first, we're looking at, did the first generation immigrants in Canada have more education and higher skills than their peers in the U.S.? The answer is yes, they do. Not surprising given the policy. And we can see that when we look at years of education, Canadian immigrants actually have more education than their native peers, a little more than a year and a half of education on average, while first-generation immigrants in the U.S. have over half a generation less on average, we need the mean for the total sample. Test scores also indicate a significant gap in literacy and numeracy skills between immigrants in the U.S. and their native peers and immigrants in Canada and their native peers. But when we look at the magnitude of the gap, we see that basically the gap between immigrants and natives in the U.S. is about 3 times the size in skills, literacy and numeracy, than the gap is in the U.S. And we see differences of 37 and 32 points in the U.S. compared to 13 and 9 points in Canada. So yes, obviously we have very different demographics in these immigrant populations. So the second question, and if this is too small to see from the back, it's actually on page 11, and then I saw the graph on page 10. There. So the second question asks, okay, we have more highly educated and highly skilled immigrants in Canada. Does that necessarily lead to higher wage positions in the country? And so the graphs here do 2 things. So on the left you see the United States, and on the right you see Canada. The bars represents the odds ratio, or the odds that an immigrant would be in that occupation. The line represents the mean wage of that occupation. So we see on the far left, the wages of occupations are very similar, or at least the trend is very similar for both the U.S. and Canada, where managers are the highest wage occupations and elementary occupations, and my paper will explain how that is, but it's an ISCO classification, single digit, are basically the lowest wage occupations in both countries. What's interesting here, let me see if I can get a little pointer thing to work. Ah, nice. What's interesting here is that in the U.S., we see service and sales workers and elementary occupations are more likely to be held by immigrants, or immigrants are more likely to be in those occupations than others. Sorry. And those are also the 2 lowest wage occupations. Where in Canada, immigrants are more likely to be in a fairly high-paying professional field, and also in one of the lowest-paying service and sales worker field. So in the United States, part of what explains the immigrant wage gap is this concentration of immigrants in low-wage fields. So we take the mean, we break it apart, we say, okay, there are definitely more immigrants in these lower wage occupational fields. But that doesn't explain the wage gap in Canada. Okay. So hypothesis 3, really simple, is, okay, the immigrant wage gap will be less pronounced in Canada relative to the US. And when we look at basically a descriptive difference, we see that that's true. So overall, the difference monthly between first-generation immigrants and natives in the US is about $282, and in Canada that difference is $233. But when I start looking at this through a path model, and I go just to the final model because you don't want to see all of them, and this is the US, and interesting here, we have this positive association between immigrant status and wage. Okay? And it's marginally significant at the 0.10 level, suggesting that after we control for education, literacy, numeracy, and all of our control variables, there's an immigrant advantage in the United States. So immigrants that have the same education, same literacy and numeracy, same age and gender are going to make more on average than their native peers in the US. In Canada, much different story. In Canada, after we control for all that, we still have a very large immigrant wage gap. And we can see that, just as we've seen in the past, education is a strong predictor of wage, and literacy and numeracy are somewhat a strong predictor of wage as well, with education predicting literacy and numeracy. Okay. So after controlling for all these host of variables, the mean wage in Canada for immigrants is significantly less than the mean wage for natives in Canada, but in the US we see an immigrant wage advantage. Okay. So our fourth hypothesis, and this is the other one that's on page 10 if you want to follow along, it says, okay, well, let's take that same model, so this final model here, and let's run it for each occupational field. So we know that the immigrant wage gap in Canada is not the result of a clustering of immigrants in Canada in low-income fields. And we know that it persists regardless of education, skills, gender, age, area of study, how many hours they work. So let's look at it by occupational field. Okay, so here these are basically standard regression coefficients. Above 0 is an immigrant advantage. Below 0 is an immigrant wage gap. The red is the United States, and the green or bluish looking thing is Canada. So on the far left was the models we just looked at, with the United States having a slight immigrant wage advantage and Canada maintaining an immigrant wage gap. And we can see that in Canada, basically every occupational field outside of professionals, we have an immigrant wage gap. After controlling for occupation now, along with education, skills, age, gender, and a host of other occupational variables. In the United States, we can see our wage advantage overall, along with a strong and significant wage advantage in plant and machine operators, where immigrants, once you match them on occupation and wage and skills, they're making substantially more. And although it looks like there are some wage gaps here because of the small sample size, none of those are significant. So we have significant, persistent wage gaps in Canada, and we have somewhat marginal wage advantages in the United States. This is something to try to explain, okay, so why do we have this persistent wage gap in Canada? And I'm going to focus mainly on this Canada graph over here. What this is each of those occupational fields plotted by the mean years of education for that occupation and the mean monthly wage. This is a low-wage occupation in Canada on this side. We can see the difference between mean years of education for a low-wage occupation for immigrants in Canada and mean years of education for a high-wage occupation immigrants in Canada is not a huge difference. Okay. So this flat line, or really lack of a correlation here, suggests that regardless of their education, immigrants in Canada can be elementary be an elementary occupation, they can be in sales, they can be professionals. Education really has very little impact on what occupation they go into. For natives in Canada, we see more of a positive slope, suggesting a relationship between years of education and the mean wage of that occupation. And for the United States, this is immigrants, meaning education is really important for immigrants in the United States. And even for natives, it's still much more important than this somewhat flat line for immigrants in Canada. So part of this could be a lack of return on education for immigrants in Canada. Okay, major findings and implications. So first, obviously, part of this is due to differences in immigration policies, right? So we have immigration policies that are designed to bring in significantly different immigrant populations, and for the most part, that's what they're doing. The other major finding is after we control for all of this stuff, education, numeracy, literacy, and a host of other demographic and work-related variables, we still have a very strong immigrant wage gap in Canada in all occupations. And that goes from about $223 a month to $601 a month. And and then the last one on this is that, as we saw before, even though we saw some kind of effects that might indicate a wage gap in the U.S. across occupational fields, there wasn't anything statistically significant about those, so we need to do some further research with hopefully a larger population to see if that really holds true. Okay, so what can we learn from this from each country? So first, as I mentioned before, in the U.S., the initial immigrant wage gap looks to be a result, primarily, of a disproportionate concentration of immigrants in these low-wage positions, as we saw from one of those earlier slides. And once we control for occupation and education and skills, that wage gap is gone. And even within those low-wage fields, there's not a wage gap. So secondly, so what does this mean policy-wise is that in the U.S., basically we have a concentration in low-wage occupations. We also have an immigrant achievement and attainment gap, suggesting basically where our focus should be in the U.S. So we have immigrants that come in earlier, generally before they finished education. Only 2% of first-generation immigrants in the U.S. came in with a foreign qualification above high school. So most of these are coming in before they're done with their schooling. So we really need to be working on K-12 or pre-K-12 outreach that is going to help with persistence and going to help us reduce the achievement and attainment gap in education in the U.S. In Canada, first it's important to point out that we know that in Canada, immigrants have more education than their native peers. But it's important to point out that it's not because of education, once I control for it and basically eliminate their benefit from education, that creates the gap. No. And once we control for education, it doesn't expose the immigrant wage gap, but it actually expands it. So it's there regardless of education. So what we would think is causing this immigrant wage gap, based on our results here, is a combination of three things. So first, underemployment. As we saw, basically individuals with high levels of education working in very low wage jobs. Second, a lack of return on their education. So considering that's their, primary economic advantage in the labor force is their advanced education, the lack of return is really hampering their wages. And third, some potential persistent inequality, which some past research has talked about as employment discrimination. So after we control for this, and I would love to hear other people's thinking about, well, what else am I missing here? What else is part of the story? But after I control for all these different things, the wage gap is still there. So what seems to be happening then, where Canada should maybe put its emphasis, is on they've done a very successful job at recruiting high-skilled, highly educated individuals, but there needs to be more support once they arrive in country to make sure that they're not being mismatched between their education and the actual occupation. And my last slide here is for future research. And this is pointed out kind of throughout some of the earlier presentations as well. But I would love to do some more research on, right now my research suggests that the differences in international versus domestic educational credentials might explain part of the Canadian wage gap, but that needs more research to really understand what's going on there. We could also do some more statistical stuff to try to match populations and then see perhaps would the same educated and skilled immigrants or skilled levels that immigrants in Canada have play out well in the US. That's just more of a statistical fun time for me. And then we could also potentially do more in-depth within occupational field investigations. So elementary occupations, managers, these are very broad fields. And I could do that with Canada, but to try to maintain a comparative perspective, considering the small sample size of the US, I wasn't able to do that. But that's something we can do in the future. And then also, that's been suggested before, is restricting the sample to those outside of typical school age. So my sample here is from 16 to 65. If we remove 16 to 23, it would provide people that are more likely to be outside of school, but it also reduces, it basically eliminates 90% of my first generation immigrants in the US, making my basically analysis impossible. So that's something in the future that we can deal with, hopefully once again with a larger sample size. And that is it. So thank you very much.